So when a student steps on the campus of a university, the history of that university becomes their history. We're standing in front of UMKC's Scofield Hall. This building's origin stretches all the way back to 1912 when it was built by a man named Walter Dickey as his family home. Walter Dickey came to Kansas City in 1888 from Toronto, Canada. He took out a loan for $100,000 and bought a manufacturing plant for baked clay, sewer pipes, and roofing tiles. Now, in those days before plastic, many things had to be done with baked clay, including water conduit, sewer pipes, roofing tiles, those kind of things. And because Kansas City was closer than his competitors in St. Louis and Chicago, he was able to corner the market on these products in the western United States. And within 5 years, he had paid off his $100,000 loan. And within 10 years, he had become one of Kansas City's richest men. You'll often hear an urban legend that Mr. Dickey built his house here on purpose to antagonize his great political rival, William Rockhill Nelson. William Nelson, owner of the Kansas City Star, had built his home on the hill north of us. Today, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art sits on that spot. And the idea was that the two were enemies, and Dickey built his house here so that whenever Nelson would come out on his back porch in the morning with his cup of coffee and his Kansas City Star, he'd have to look up and see Dickey's house higher than his on the hill to the south. Well, like all urban legends, there's a grain of truth and there's a lot that's been made up. In actuality, the two were not exactly friends, but on friendly terms. Both were huge admirers of President Theodore Roosevelt, and both were hugely against the Kansas City Democratic Party machine led by Tom Pendergast here in Kansas City. So they were on friendly terms in 1912 when the house was built. However, that would soon change. In the presidential election of 1912, Mr. Nelson backed Theodore Roosevelt, Mr. Dickey backed Howard Taft. And when Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, won, Nelson and Dickey would never speak again. Now, Mr. Nelson died in 1915, and he left provisions in his will that his assets be sold, his home tore down, and an art museum be built in its place. So you'd think that whatever this feud was between Dickey and Nelson would have died then. In 1920, Mr. Dickey decided he was going to run for Republican ward chairman. Very small political office here in Kansas City. The Kansas City Star published a disparaging article about him, and Mr. Dickey ended up losing the race for ward chairman. And those lingering resentments he had against Nelson bubbled to the surface. And he turned his anger against the Kansas City Star itself, and he vowed he was going to put the Star out of business. And so he bought the Star's competitors, the Kansas City Journal and the Kansas City Post, and over the next decade, he poured his entire fortune and his entire company's fortune into trying to put the Star out of business. At one point, he took the trustees of Nelson's estate to the Supreme Court because they refused to sell the Star to him. The result was that he bankrupted himself and he bankrupted his company. He had to mortgage his home and the 10-acre property it sits on for $75,000, which was less than 10% of the money he had invested in it. In 1931, Mr. Dickey was a broken and bankrupt man. He passed away in January of that year inside his home here on Rock Hill, leaving his heirs and his children nothing but a pile of bills. William Volker came to the children and said, "I'm sorry to hear about your dad. I hear you have this giant mortgage you can't pay. Why don't you let me pay for the mortgage, and then I'll donate the home and the property to the University of Kansas City?" Because just a year earlier, he had purchased the Volker campus right to our north. And his children said yes. And so just like that, the Volker campus had an additional 10 acres and now a first building that it could use to start a university. When William Volker donated this house to the university in January of 1931, the trustees now had a mission to raise $5 million to build other campus buildings and to open the university. However, this was the very heart of the Great Depression, and it was very difficult for them to raise money. So after 2 years, the spring of 1933, they came to Mr. Volker and they said, "Mr. Volker, we haven't even been able to raise $2 million, and we think we need $5 million. We don't know what to do. I think we should give up." And Mr. Volker said, "No, we're not giving up. We're going to open this fall." Any shortfalls in revenue, I'm going to cover. So the trustees now had a very short window to prepare the old Dickey Mansion, now called the Administration Building, for its use as the University of Kansas City's main building. Offices were created out of closets and pantries. Classrooms were created out of bedrooms. The attic was turned into a small cafeteria. The kitchen was turned into science labs. Mr. Dickey's library, today the Language Resource Center here in Scofield Hall, became the university's first library. Even this space here, the entryway of the home, was put to use, and this was an event space. And students would even have formal dances in this space. When the University of Kansas City opened, this back porch was our stage to the world. This is the most historic spot in the entire university. This is where, for generations of our students, where convocation was held, where graduation was held. And whenever we had an important event, this is where it happened. When President Harry Truman came and spoke at the university, he spoke right here. When Miguel Alemán, president of Mexico, came and spoke, this is where he spoke. When Prime Minister Lilliquat Khan of Pakistan came in 1950, this is where he spoke. And these bronze plaques on the side here memorialize those events. This was the spot where students would protest in the early years of the university. The first protest was in the spring of 1934. The university had decided to fire 3 very popular professors, and the students were outraged. So they held a one-day boycott of classes and protested here, right in this spot. Personally, my favorite protest is from 1956. The students had been long told that they would be able to associate with national fraternities and sororities, but this had been denied. And so in 1956, the students were fed up. They backed a hearse up onto the quad, they pulled out a coffin, and they paraded it around the quad. And on that coffin was a big sign that said, "Dreams and Hopes of National Fraternities." And there were students playing the drums and the trumpets, and they gave it a New Orleans-style funeral around the quad. And then they marched it through the administration building down to a spot next to the Playhouse where they buried it. The most famous protest at the university, however, was the March riots of 1961. For many years, the University of Kansas City had financial difficulties. Each year, there would be a large budget shortfall that the trustees would have to fill with unrestricted gifts from donors. In March of 1961, they discovered they had a $300,000 budget shortfall. And so they turned to the president of the university, Richard Drake, and they told him to cut that amount from the budget. He responded by cutting athletics. This enraged the students, who immediately began to protest. They went down to the Final Four basketball tournament at Municipal Auditorium and protested there. And the next morning they came right here to this spot and built a giant bonfire and built effigies of the trustees and lit the bonfire on fire and threw the effigies on. When the fire department showed to put out the fire, the students stood around the fire and chanted, "We want sports! We want sports!" Well, the fallout from this was that the president of the university, Richard Drake, resigned. He just felt he could not raise the money necessary to keep this university afloat. So therefore, the trustees turned to the vice president of academic affairs, a man named Carlton Scofield, and they said, "We need you to step in and become president." And Carlton Scofield said, "Absolutely not." And they said, "Please, we need you to become president and help us steer the university through this difficult time." And he said, "I will become president under one condition. You start a search for a new president, and I am not to be a candidate." Carlton Scofield immediately began the business of trying to raise money for the university. And it was a very difficult task indeed. At this same time, the University of Missouri approached him and said, "We've been thinking for some time now of expanding into the Kansas City area. It would be much easier if we could just take over an existing campus, such as the University of Kansas City, rather than have to build our own campus. Why don't you go to the trustees and approach them with this idea of merging the two institutions, and the University of Kansas City would become part of the University of Missouri?" So President Scofield went to the trustees, and they were dead set against it. Many of these men on the board of trustees had been with the university for decades and invested countless hours of their time and much of their own money in this university. They were proud of their accomplishment, and they also valued the freedom of being a private university. However, as the years went on, things began to deteriorate even more. In the fall of 1962, the University of Missouri approached Carlton Scofield again, and they said, "We are coming to Kansas City. That means we're either going to merge with the University of Kansas City, or we're just going to buy land and build our own campus." Well, Carlton Scofield realized that if the University of Missouri built their own campus, it would put the University of Kansas City out of business. And so he commissioned a report from his staff to show how much money the university was projected to lose each year for the next 10 years. And by 1970, the university was projected to lose over $2 million a year. And so that would mean that the trustees would have to raise that money through unrestricted financial gifts just to keep the university afloat. Forget about building an endowment, forget about building new buildings or new programs. That was just to keep the doors of the university open. And so we took this information to the trustees, and they realized they had no choice but to merge with the University of Missouri. So in January of 1963, they agreed to the terms of the University of Missouri. And in July of 1963, it became official. The University of Kansas City became part of the University of Missouri system. UKC became UMKC. In 1976, the curators of the University of Missouri decided to rename the administration building Scofield Hall in honor of Carlton Scofield and his contributions to saving the university.